Dawn. February 16th, 1945. The North Pacific in winter. The sea is gray, the sky lower still. A ceiling of cloud that flattens everything beneath it to the same color. From the coast of Japan, the horizon is empty. It has been empty for days. The outer ring of the Empire's defense network, picket boats, shore observation posts, listening stations strung across thousands of miles of open water, has detected nothing, reported nothing. The home islands, as they have been since the beginning of this war, are safe. Then the sound arrives before anything else. Not one engine, not 10. Something deeper, a rising, compounding roar, as if the ocean has found its voice and aimed it at the sky. From the invisible carriers, hull down below the horizon, what rises is not the ships themselves. What rises is everything they carry. On the bridge of one of those ships, a man sits in a chair. He wears his khaki cap turned backward, a habit so old it has become a trademark, though it began as practicality, the long bills shielding his eyes from aircraft exhaust on the flight deck. His face is weathered beyond his 57 years, skin pulled tight over sharp bones, pale blue eyes watching the planes climb and form and angle north. He does not consult charts. He watches his planes. He has watched planes launch from carrier decks for a long time. The man is Vice Admiral Mark Andrew Mitcher, and he has been to this coast before. Go back 3 years, April 18th, 1942. The same gray Pacific. A younger Mark Mitcher, Captain Mitcher then, stands on the bridge of USS Hornet, watching 16 Army B-25 Mitchell bombers struggle off the flight deck into a wind-whipped sea. They were never supposed to launch that day, not at that hour, not from that position. A Japanese picket boat had spotted the fleet 650 miles from the Japanese coast, and the decision was immediate. Launch now, launch early, launch far, and pray the boats hadn't gotten a message off before they were sunk. 16 borrowed Army bombers, one carrier, 650 miles, and the captain of that carrier hoping with everything he had that nobody would find him. 3 years later, he has 1,000 planes. He is 60 miles from the same coast. That distance, from 650 miles to 60, from 16 planes to 1,000, from hoping not to be found to not caring whether Japan knows, is not simply a measure of advance across a map. It is the measure of what 3 years of war built, and what it cost, and what it could not prevent. This is that story. Japan's military establishment understood the Doolittle raid for exactly what it was. 16 bombers, one carrier, launched well beyond sustainable strike range on a mission with no return. A stunt. A propaganda operation conducted by a nation desperate for a victory it could name. The material damage was negligible. The planes never came back to their carrier. Japan's military press described it as a surprise visit and moved on. The myth of the inviolable home island absorbed the shock with barely a tremor. What followed reinforced the myth. From late 1944 onward, B-29 superfortresses from the Marianas Islands droned over Japan in high-altitude formations. Distant, impersonal. You could hear them before you saw them, and sometimes you couldn't see them at all. The Japanese called them B-san, a grim familiarity, as if naming the thing made it manageable. The propaganda apparatus framed the raids as cowardly terror bombing conducted from remote bases by an enemy unwilling to come within reach. The outer defense perimeter held. The home islands remained beyond touch. Japan's doctrine rested on a layered assumption. The Empire's island fortresses, strung across the Central Pacific, the Philippines, the Marianas, formed a buffer that no enemy fleet could breach intact. And even if the outer rings fell, home waters were protected by geography, by shore-based air power, and by a network of picket boats. Fishing vessels pressed into military service, stationed at intervals across the approaches to Japan, equipped with radio and radar. These boats were the Empire's ears. Any carrier force entering their net would trigger an alarm. Japan would have time. By February 1945, every one of those outer fortresses was gone. The Gilberts, the Marshalls, the Marianas, the Philippines, taken or bypassed, their garrisons cut off and dying. What remained was the picket net, the shore-based air, and the belief, still held by the Japanese public, still insisted upon by the military government, that the home islands could not be touched from the sea. They were about to find out what that meant. At Pearl Harbor, on the morning of December 7th, 1941, the United States had 3 aircraft carriers in the Pacific Ocean. By February 1945, it had more than 50. Ulithi Atoll in the Caroline Islands, a horseshoe of coral enclosing a lagoon large enough to hide a city, had filled in January 1945 with ships. Hundreds of them. Battleships and cruisers anchored in rows, destroyers swinging at buoys, and carriers, fleet carriers, light carriers, escort carriers, grey hulls stretching to every horizon of the lagoon. Sailors aboard the smaller ships said you could walk from one side to the other without touching water. It was not quite true, but you understood why they said it. At midnight on January 26th, the fleet changed its name, quietly, with no ceremony. An administrative transition documented in logs and signal traffic. Admiral Halsey's 3rd Fleet and Task Force 38 became Admiral Raymond Spruance's 5th Fleet and Task Force 58 under Vice Admiral Mitcher. The ships were identical. The planes were the same, but the command teams had rotated, Halsey and his staff stepping back to plan the next campaign while Spruance and Mitcher stepped forward to execute this one. To Japanese intelligence, which tracked American fleet designations with genuine attention, this suggested 2 separate, massive naval forces operating in the Pacific simultaneously. The deception was elegant. There were not 2 fleets. There was one fleet that never stopped. Task Force 58, as it assembled for the operation, was the most powerful naval striking force yet assembled. 11 fleet carriers, 6 light carriers, 8 fast battleships, 16 cruisers, 73 destroyers, and across their combined flight decks, more than 1,000 aircraft. Hellcats and Corsairs for the fighter sweeps, Helldivers for the dive bombing runs, Avengers for the level attacks against industrial targets. Admiral Spruance flew his flag from the heavy cruiser Indianapolis, watching from a remove that suited his temperament, methodical, analytical, the cold strategic mind behind the movement. Mitcher was closer to the planes. In the 5 task groups, 2 of the carriers were veterans of the war's first year. USS Enterprise and USS Saratoga, the oldest hulls in the fleet, formed the Night Attack Group, Task Group 58.5. Task Group 58.1, the formation that would fly closest to Japan during the strikes, was built around a different Hornet, CV-12, the second ship to bear that name, led by Rear Admiral Joseph J. Clark. Jocko Clark, they called him, aggressive, forward of Cherokee descent, one of the first Native Americans to graduate from the Naval Academy. His task group would be the tip of the spear. Task Force 58 slipped out of Ulithi on February 10th and turned north. The route exploited the winter weather, thick overcast, low ceiling, limited visibility, the kind of sky that hides things. American submarines moved ahead of the fleet's course, not to fight, but to listen and to quietly remove what remained of Japan's picket network. One by one, the fishing vessels that formed the Empire's early warning system along the northern approach were sunk. No alarm was transmitted. The ears of Japan's home defense went silent before they had anything to report. B-29s and Navy patrol bombers scouted the route ahead. Radio deception filled the frequencies with the traffic patterns of a fleet that was somewhere else entirely. The task force moved north through winter darkness, 1,000 ships worth of steel and fuel and ordnance and men, and Japan did not know it was there. The night before the strikes, February 15th, few men slept. Not because the fleet was noisy. Ships maintained strict discipline at sea, but because of what the morning held. More than half of Task Force 58's air groups had never flown a combat mission. Veterans tried to explain what to expect. No explanation was quite adequate. The fleet sat 60 miles off the coast of Honshu in the dark, turning gently into a cold North Pacific wind. Dawn comes gray. The carriers heel into the wind, and the flight decks come alive with a choreography so practiced it looks effortless. It is not. Yellow-jerseyed plane directors guide aircraft into position. Red jerseys handle the ordnance, bombs, rockets, belted rounds. Green jerseys crouch near the catapults, checking, signaling, releasing. The noise is enormous. The cold is worse. This is not the Pacific these men know. This is not the warm blue water off the Philippines, not the tropical swells of the Carolines or the Marshalls. This is the North Pacific in February. The wind off the deck comes with teeth. Pilots pull leather and sheepskin tight and drop into cockpits that have been sitting in temperatures near freezing all night. Oil has thickened. Hydraulic fluid has congealed in lines. And the guns, the 6.50 caliber Brownings mounted in the wings of the Hellcats, the weapons every fighter pilot will depend on over Tokyo, are already half frozen. At altitude, over the Japanese coast, they will be worse. The first planes leave the decks just after dawn. Fighters climbing through the overcast in sections, forming up above the clouds by sound and instrument and the training that has made these men what they are. Then the dive bombers, lumbering off the deck with their bomb loads, climbing more slowly, finding their escort. Then the Avengers, heavy and purposeful. The forming up takes time. Then the first groups turn north, toward the coast. Japan does not scramble a defense. The picket net is already dead. The coast of Honshu comes up through breaks in the cloud. Gray-green hills above gray sea. Then the sprawl of the Tokyo plain. Factory smoke mixing with low overcast, the white of recent snow on rooftops. Mount Fuji stands to the southwest when the clouds part, its cone brilliant white against the murk, indifferent to everything beneath it. The Japanese capital spreads outward from the imperial palace grounds in every direction. The fighters' sweeps hit the airfields first. Konoike, Kasumigaura, Katori, Atsugi, Yokosuka. The aircraft in their revetments, Japanese planes parked wingtip to wingtip, a habit born from peacetime efficiency that concentrates losses badly, are caught on the ground. Strafing runs send rounds walking across tarmac. Fuel tanks detonate. Oily black smoke rises from a dozen fields at once, visible from 30 miles out at sea. Japanese fighters do get airborne. Some of them. They come up in small groups, disorganized, their coordination broken by the speed of the attack and the destruction already done to their communications. And then something happens that American aviators will discuss for days afterward. The Japanese turn away. They climb, they engage briefly, and they go west. Over their own capital, over Tokyo Bay, over the most important airspace in the empire. They go west. Between Tokyo and Yokohama, the anti-aircraft guns throw everything available into the sky. The corridor lights up with black and gray bursts appearing without warning, close enough to rattle the airframes, close enough to fill cockpits with the sharp smell of cordite. The air crews call it Flak Highway. The name spreads across the fleet within hours. The guns are experienced. The volume is intense. But the defense is disorganized, broken by surprise, broken by scale, broken by the fundamental fact that this attack was not supposed to be possible from this direction. Hell divers push over into their dives above it, pulling out low over the industrial outskirts of the city. Avengers make their level runs against aircraft engine plants, factories, the infrastructure that feeds Japan's military production. Ships in Tokyo Bay are struck and sinking, oil spreading on the cold February water. The fleet operates through that day and through the next. 2 full days. 60 miles off Honshu. Task Force 58 launches and recovers, launches and recovers. Over those 2 days, it flew 2,761 sorties. American aviators claimed 341 Japanese aircraft destroyed in the air, 190 more on the ground against the loss of 88 American aircraft. Japan's military would eventually admit to 78. The material damage is not in dispute. Neither is the fleet itself, intact, turning south on the evening of February 17th, having done what it came to do. 3 years earlier, a captain named Mitcher launched 16 planes from 650 miles and prayed. His 1,000 have now been airborne over Tokyo for 2 days. The arithmetic has changed beyond recognition. On the evening of February 17th, aboard the new Hornet, the ship's captain sat down to write a letter to his wife. "You can imagine how tremendously thrilled we are tonight," he wrote. "We always knew we could walk right up to Tokyo Bay." He had made a speech over the ship's loudspeaker. He knew she and the children would be pleased. It is the sound of men who believe they have won something decisive. The confidence was real. Japan was not finished. In Japan, February 16th had produced a different kind of fear. B-29 raids could be framed, to civilians, even to oneself, as something abstract. The bombers came from altitude, from formations so high they were sometimes invisible, just sound and then explosions and distant smoke. The carrier fighters were something else. They came low and fast, sweeping down the airfields and the roads, individual aircraft with individual cockpits, their national markings readable from 100 feet. Japanese accounts describe men and women stopping in the street to watch, close enough to see into the cockpits. The B-29s had been a distant abstraction. This was a man in a machine, over their city. For Japan's military leadership, the implications were immediate. If American carriers could position themselves 60 miles off Honshu for 2 full days and absorb whatever defense Japan could mount, then the outer perimeter doctrine was not merely failing. It was finished. Whatever was going to protect the home islands now would have to be something else. Japan's high command already knew what that something else was. By late 1944, Japan had already begun the systematic transition away from conventional air defense toward a strategy built on mass suicide attack. The Kamikaze Corps was not improvised desperation. It was calculated doctrine. The logic was cold. Japan could no longer match American production in aircraft or pilots. But a pilot willing to die on his first mission could achieve what a trained pilot on his 50th could not by guaranteeing his aircraft reached its target. Japan needed only enough aircraft, concentrated and launched in overwhelming numbers, to make the cost of an Allied landing on the home islands unbearable. It was building exactly that, and it was building something more specific. At a plant in Ota, 40 miles northwest of Tokyo, workers were producing the Yokosuka MXY-7 Oka, a rocket-powered aircraft with no landing gear, no return capability, no purpose other than to be carried aloft by a larger bomber and released toward an American carrier at terminal velocity. The Oka was not a fighter. It was a weapon. A carrier-killing weapon designed specifically for the kind of fleet now operating 60 miles off the coast. The pilots who turned away over Tokyo in February 1945 were not broken. They were being conserved. Japan's leadership understood that every fighter pilot spent in a conventional defense of the capital was a pilot unavailable for the mass assault being prepared for any Allied landing. The apparent rout in the air above Tokyo was, in part, a deliberate calculation. The fleet had not simply won. It had been permitted to win over Tokyo by conventional rules, while Japan prepared to fight it differently, somewhere else, on its own terms. The men in the fleet did not know this. They knew what they had seen. Japanese fighters turning west, refusing the engagement, abandoning their own capital's airspace, American after-action reports noted that Japanese planes fled to the west, refusing to meet the American challenge, that the enemy was notably inferior in aggressiveness, tactics, and determination. The conclusion was almost irresistible. Japan's air power had broken. Task Force 58 returned for a second strike on Tokyo on February 25th. The weather had closed in. Snow, storm, the North Pacific asserting its February character, and Mitchell cut the strikes short. But before the weather ended the mission, the Avengers and Hell Divers found the plant at Ote. American intelligence had recently confirmed what was being built there. The fleet that Ota's factories were designed to destroy sent its aircraft in and left the facility burning. The carriers that the Oka was engineered specifically to sink bombed the plant that built it. Mitchell cancelled further strikes as the weather deteriorated and the fleet turned south. The Marines on Iwo Jima had been fighting since February 19th. The island was costing more dead per acre than anywhere else in the Pacific, and it was not finished. Task Force 58 came south to support the battle. Then came Okinawa. The fleet that had operated almost at will off Tokyo sailed south. What it found at Okinawa was the answer to a question it hadn't known to ask. April 6, 1945. The Japanese launched Kikusui No. 1, the first mass kamikaze assault of the Okinawa campaign. Nearly 700 aircraft in 30 hours, not in ones and twos, in waves, not conventional fighters conducting conventional attacks. Aircraft flown by pilots who had taken off, knowing they would not land. The destroyer Hainsworth, present at the Tokyo strikes 2 months earlier, the ship that had sunk Japanese picket boats in Tokyo Bay during the raids, was among the first American ships struck. The fleet that had watched Japanese fighters flee west over their own capital was now fighting for its survival against an enemy that had stopped fighting the way the fleet knew how to fight. The pilots who turned away in February came back in April as something else entirely. Ships burned. Men died in numbers the fleet's most pessimistic planners had not projected. The Okinawa campaign would cost the Fifth Fleet more ships and more men than any other naval campaign in American history. This was the payoff for what Japan had been building while its fighters fled west. By summer 1945, the fleet had come back, operating now as Task Force 38 under Admiral Halsey and Vice Admiral McCain, the same rotation, the same ships, the same sustained carrier power. It returned to Japanese home waters and did not leave. Battleships ranged along the eastern coast of Honshu and shelled industrial installations from the sea. Carrier aircraft flew daily over the home islands, hitting Tokyo, Yokohama, Nagoya, the naval base at Kure. There was no outer defense perimeter to negotiate. There was no myth of invulnerability to penetrate. It had been penetrated in February and had not closed behind them. The men who served in that fleet gave it a name. The fleet that came to stay, not a fleet that struck and retreated. Not a fleet running the calculus of sustainable exposure. A fleet that came to the Japanese coast and stopped moving because it could. On August 15, 1945, the Japanese government announced its surrender. The announcement reached the fleet while a strike package was airborne, inbound toward Tokyo. Recall orders went out. The planes turned back. 6 Hellcats were still airborne when 15 to 20 Japanese fighters attacked them. A final interception, conducted by men who had not received the surrender order or who had received it and could not stop. The Hellcats shot down 9 of them. The last aerial combat of the Pacific War was a carrier fight over Japanese airspace. The war had begun with Japanese carrier aircraft, launched from 6 fleet carriers in the North Pacific, destroying the American battleship fleet at Pearl Harbor on a December morning in 1941. It ended with American carrier aviation unchallenged over Japan. The weapon Japan had perfected, America had mastered completely. The weapon America had nearly lost in the war's first year, it had rebuilt into something Japan had no answer for. Mark Mitcher did not live long after it ended. The Pacific campaign had run through him in ways that did not show fully in the moment, but accumulated over years. The unrelenting pressure of command, the sleepless nights, the weight of sending men into weather like February over Tokyo and waiting to count who came back. Admiral Nimitz wrote that Mitcher was the most experienced and most able officer in the handling of fast carrier task forces who has yet been developed, and that it is doubtful if any officer has made more important contributions toward the extinction of the enemy fleet. Mitcher died in February 1947. 18 months after the surrender, he was 59 years old. What the war had asked of him, his body had given, and the account was closed before the world he helped create had finished taking shape. On a cold February morning in 1945, a man in a bridge chair with his cap turned backward watched his planes climb into the winter overcast over Japan. 3 years earlier, from this same coast, he had launched 16 borrowed bombers from 650 miles and prayed no one had found him. Now there were 1,000, rising into the gray. He watched them go. What he built outlasted him.